Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The anger of the betrayed woman, one Betty Broderick married. Dawn Broderick, in the late 1960s, she thought she had everything she ever dreamed of. Dan was ambitious, smart, and a promising law student. Betty, on the other hand, was a beautiful and intelligent woman, hardworking and admired by those around her. They were deeply in love with each other. They dreamed about their future, imagining they would grow old together. The early years of their marriage were filled with financial struggles. Don wanted to go to medical school, but later realized he could be more successful as a lawyer and decided to study law instead. Betty worked hard to support the family while Dan completed his studies. During the day, she worked various jobs, and in the evenings, she took care of their children. She also helped Dan with his schoolwork, doing everything she could to ensure his success. Although it was a challenging time for them, Betty believed that one day her sacrifices would pay off. When Dan graduated from law school and became a successful attorney, their standard of living improved dramatically.
They moved
into a luxurious home, bought expensive cars. Betty was now proud to see Dan making money as a successful lawyer. She felt that her years of sacrifices were finally being rewarded. She could now focus on her children and manage their home to the best of her ability. However, what Betty didn't realize was that their marriage was slowly starting to change. Dan began to spend more and more time at work. Business dinners, late-night meetings, and frequent trips became a part of their lives. At first, Betty thought this was a natural part of a successful man's life. But as Dan's indifference grew, she started to feel a deep sense of unease. Over time, Betty noticed that Dan's behavior had changed. He no longer showed interest in her, and instead of spending time with her, he began coming home later and later, often using work as an excuse. He stopped telling her that he loved her, and sometimes he seemed to avoid her altogether. Betty initially thought this was due to stress and work pressure. However, when she felt the coldness in Dan's eyes, her suspicions began to grow. Dan's secretary Linda was a young woman who stood out for her beauty and cheerful demeanor. Betty didn't want to think much about this young woman who worked with her husband, but as Dan continued to come home later and later, even during holidays, using work as an excuse to stay away from her, Betty's suspicions were heightened. As she felt Dan distancing himself from her, a sense of fear and anger began to grow inside her. Betty tried to understand whether her feelings were right. She repeatedly asked Dan what the cause of this change was, but Dan always gave evasive answers. "I'm just working hard, Betty, you know that. Or why do you keep questioning me?" were the usual responses, and he would end the conversation. But Betty's unease never went away. She felt more and more alone with each passing day. Deep down, she knew that the man she had dedicated her years, youth, and energy to was now turning toward another woman, but she didn't want to accept it. One day, Betty found a hotel receipt in Dan's jacket pocket. In that moment, the world collapsed around her. No matter how prepared she thought she was, seeing the truth with proof shook her to the core. All the doubts that had lingered inside her were replaced by a painful truth. Dan was cheating on her. The man she had devoted her life to was preparing to leave her for a younger woman. This event marked a breaking point for Betty. Nothing would ever be the same again. When Betty confirmed that Dan had been unfaithful to her, she found it difficult to describe the pain and anger inside her. Learning that the man she had trusted and believed in for all those years was building another life behind her back had dragged Betty into a deep darkness. Her suspicions had turned into the worst possible reality. In that moment, she thought everything suddenly lost its meaning. The greatest source of trust in her life had brought her the greatest betrayal. The future she had dreamed of when she got married was now crumbling piece by piece. The home they had built together over the years, the memories, the hopes, and their children. All of it had turned into nothing but broken shards. However, the thing that hurt her the most was Dan's indifferent attitude towards her. In those moments, Betty had turned into a stranger in Dan's eyes. The man she had shared her life with for so many years no longer took her presence seriously. At first, Betty tried to gather herself and chose to confront Dan. She wanted to give him one last chance, hoping he might change his mind. She begged, showing him the broken pieces in her eyes, trying to understand him. But when Dan coldly said, "I want a divorce," Betty's world came crashing down. Those words felt like a knife stabbing into her heart. Dan's clarity and ruthlessness instantly knocked Betty to the ground. The divorce process turned into a nightmare for Betty. Dan's high-profile lawyer gained the upper hand at every step, while Betty's emotional and mental collapse left her completely defenseless. In court, Dan's powerful connections and financial resources invalidated every move Betty made, and her situation kept getting worse. The only thing she had left to hold on to was her emotional well-being, but even that was quickly draining away. As a mother, the greatest pain Betty experienced was realizing that her children were not on her side. In the custody battle, the children chose to stay with Dan. Betty would have preferred losing everything rather than losing them, but she was faced with legal and judicial barriers as tall as mountains. The alienation she saw in her children's eyes left an indescribable emptiness in her heart. How could I lose them? She thought, but she never received an answer. One day, Betty saw the luxurious life Dan and Linda were living. She hadn't been inside their house, but as she passed by, she saw that a new world was being created there. Dan's loving gaze toward another woman opened a new wound inside Betty. With every step, she felt more worthless, as if she were a discarded, forgotten woman. The man she had once loved was now a stranger to her. Dan's life, built with her betrayal, enraged Betty to the point of madness, and one day, when everything reached its breaking point, the anger inside her became uncontrollable. She was now a woman who only sought to defend herself, to avenge the pain of everything she had lost. One morning, she went to Dan's house and crashed her car into his garage door. However, what she did was just an outburst of temporary rage. Dan's response deepened the pain even more. A mocking smile and simply closing the door. At that moment, Betty understood. There was no turning back now. The anger she felt had left her conscience and logic behind. From that day on, believing that justice was only in her own hands, she decided to continue the fight. Nothing and no one could make her turn back. The plans in her mind had now turned into cold, calculated rage. The divorce process had become nothing short of a nightmare for Betty. Dan used his legal power at every opportunity, striking her with every move. She found herself being slowly dragged into a life that was vanishing. Dan's lawyer, not only powerful but also ruthless in his strategy, was pushing Betty further into a corner at each court session. Against Betty's emotional collapse, Dan's calm and calculated demeanor was like a knife cutting through her. Each passing day made Betty lose more of herself. The life she had dedicated years to was slipping away like a gamble lost at the table. And the most painful part was that every decision regarding the custody of their children was coming out in Dan's favor. Betty didn't just lose her children. She was also beginning to lose the love and desire to protect them. No matter how much she felt this emptiness inside, no matter how much she struggled, in those moments, she was always losing. Her children were becoming closer to Dan's new life, his new family. The love, anger, and disappointment in Betty's heart were mixing together. Don no longer hid his relationship with Linda. The photos in the newspapers were tearing Betty's heart apart more with each passing day. Dan and Linda posing together at luxury parties, appearing in newspapers, symbolized the final point for Betty. One photo she saw in the newspaper triggered an eruption inside her. Dan was smiling with Linda, the man she had dedicated her life to. The man who once was everything to her was now alienated from her, busy smiling at another woman. The anger and jealousy inside her began to rise without ever calming down. One morning, Betty spent the entire morning staring at this photo, feeling helpless and suffocated. She couldn't take it anymore. The anger she felt didn't just bring her pain, it was also creating a breaking point inside her. That morning, she made her decision. She would go to Dan, confront him, and make him pay for everything. Gathering all her courage, Betty drove her car to Dan's house. She stopped in front of the garage door. That house had once been her home, but now another woman lived inside it. Linda, in this foreign world that now embraced her, Betty's presence meant nothing. She felt like just a ghost. But her anger had blinded her. She quickly got out of the car and opened the garage door. Slowly, she walked inside. "You ruined me, Dan," she yelled. In that moment, she had lost her whole world and had bottled up all the pain of everything she had lost. Don calmly rose from his chair. "Betty, you need to calm down. This isn't like you," he said. Those words only made Betty more furious. Dan's cold demeanor reminded her once again how the man she had fought for and dedicated her life to had become so cold and heartless. At that moment, Betty had reached a point of no return. She decided to release all her anger and the destruction of her world in an explosive outburst. She would not let anything stop her. When the divorce was finalized, Dan and Linda decided to get married. Betty found herself in the midst of loneliness and betrayal. Her children were standing by Dan's side, turning toward him. Betty felt that something had already ended in her world. Everything had been lost. Now, only revenge and anger remained in her life. That night, there was a fire in Betty's eyes. This fire inside her would drive her one step further. One night, Betty gathered all her anger and took her gun. She had lost everything, but those losses were now directing her toward a target. Her target was the man she had once shared everything with, the man she had trusted, and now she wanted to take revenge on him, to make him suffer. As she held the gun in her hand, there was a noticeable determination in her eyes. There was no other option now. The emptiness inside her had started to fill with revenge. She moved toward Dan's house. That house had once been the place where they had created happy memories together. But now, everything was different. She silently entered, carefully stepping forward. She headed to the bedroom. Dan and Linda were fast asleep. Betty decided to wrap up all the anger, pain, and disappointment she had accumulated over the years in a single moment. When she pulled the trigger, she realized it was the final point. The sound of the gunshot tore through the night silence. And in that moment, she knew her life had changed completely. She thought everything was over. But after the shot, a deep silence settled, and the unrest in Betty's heart grew deeper. What now? At that moment, she tried to comprehend how she would pay for what she had done. Looking back, she realized that her once shattered life, the lost love, the children turning their backs on her, and Dawn becoming a complete stranger to her, was all just a chain reaction. Everything had started to change after the first betrayal, and now it had led to this outcome. The sound of police sirens brought Betty back to the real world. There was something she needed to escape, but couldn't. The truths were now in the hands of others. Remembering that night, Betty quickly tried to leave the scene. But with every step, the weight of the burdens she couldn't leave behind was felt more heavily. Betty's story would come to a conclusion through laws and justice, but her inner journey was far from over. That night she knew that by stepping into Dan and Linda's lives, she would have to pay the price for that action. However, as she continued to survive, there was one truth that everything had taught her. Revenge did not bring the expected satisfaction. The emptiness inside her could only be filled not with a new vengeance, but with understanding her past mistakes. Before her eyes, the house she had dreamed of for years now stood as a cold and foreign place. Betty realized that her true loss was the loss of the real meaning of the things in her life that she had once valued so deeply. Her children, even though they were on Dan's side, would one day grow up and understand the truth. And maybe, one day, they would be able to forgive their mother for the mistakes she made. But for now, the void she had left in their hearts was her burden. The confrontation with Dan and Linda had perhaps provided a momentary satisfaction, but Betty's real battle was still within herself. The battle continued, not only in the external world but within her. She realized that all the feelings of revenge had only isolated her further. Now, in a prison cell, she was trying to understand what it was she had been waiting for all along.